If we think about how a project typically comes into being, it usually starts with a need. For example, here we have a female farmer who needs a technological innovation, a new practice, a new product, or something along those lines. But it could also be small and medium-sized businesses, startups, young people in rural areas, or older people in rural areas. So, there are various possibilities here. In any case, a need is identified and someone dedicates themselves to addressing this need and starts an initiative. That means a project is launched here, a person gets involved and brings together others to form a project team. That's what we're particularly interested in. So, projects where more than one person is involved, usually different people, because that's also very common in the CAP strategic plan, and of course, those are the more complex projects. And this group then works together on a project, within a project timeframe, towards a result and an impact. I'm intentionally keeping it very broad as to what this working process looks like. What's much more important is what comes out of it in the end, and that's already very different each time. These can be concepts and technologies that result from such projects. They can be products and infrastructures that have been created or installed and are then available. But of course, they can also be services and networks. That means, even just within the framework of the CAP strategic plan, in other words, in the Common Agricultural Policy, all these different outcomes are possible, and of course, they have very different effects. But now, looking ahead to what comes after, that is, the sustainability, this also opens up very different possibilities for how these results and effects can continue. So, probably the most understandable scenario is, everything just continues as before. The result that was created here, the achievement or the effect that was accomplished, remains in place, just as it is, one-to-one. You manage to maintain what was developed by the end of the project over the long term, to continue providing for the target group we saw at the very beginning, those who have the needs, and to ensure that those needs are met on a lasting basis. Of course, there is another possibility, that the cooperation continues to work together. That means, in a sense, the end of the project does not necessarily mark the end. You have to keep working to maintain the impact, or even to increase it. So, that is also certainly possible. Or, and this is another option, you hand over the project result. This is very often the case with research-oriented or innovation-driven projects, where the project team works on a solution within a project, and then someone else picks it up and continues working with it. That means what changes then is the project team, the actors, and they carry on from there. So these are all possibilities for how things can continue after a project ends. But of course, that's still not everything. Naturally, there are many more possibilities. But I'll stop here for now, because today we're especially interested in these first three scenarios. So, what matters is to continue what you create in projects or initiatives as closely as possible, or even to increase its impact. That's what we're aiming for here today, and that's what we'd like to provide answers to how this is possible and which factors play a role.
Often, people still think in terms of a project logic, which makes perfect sense. You get funding for 2, 3, 4, or 5 years, depending on the project. And for that period, you can plan quite well. But what gets left behind are these impact chains and missions, which really need to be thought of in the long term. A second observation is that actors often jump from topic to topic, depending on what's currently in vogue or what calls for proposals are out at the moment. That's totally understandable, but of course it also has the downside that knowledge gets lost through these shifts in topics. But there are also very practical aspects that we've been able to observe. For example, there's not much knowledge when it comes to project chains. So, there's also little knowledge about how to cleverly link different funding opportunities so that I can keep working on the same topic. How can I also plan these project chains as effectively as possible from the start? And last but not least, of course, it's often difficult to finance dry spells between projects. Bridging funds are challenging, and knowledge about them is often not widely available either. Based on that, we also thought about what we can recommend to you now. when you are working on your projects and planning new ones. As Michael already mentioned at the beginning, it's absolutely advisable to think in advance about where the region, the organization, or your own business wants to position itself. And what big goal do you want to contribute to? What is the big mission that you are passionate about? And how can you pursue this topic in a sustainable way and keep working on it? It's really important that this starts before the project even begins, and not only once the project is underway or when the funding is running out, that you start thinking, what do we do now? How do we move forward? So, in this regard, we talk about these impact frameworks. It's really worth taking the time to consider which impact framework is important to me, and how can I make sure, even during the project, that I don't lose sight of these impacts, this big goal I'm working towards. And how can I keep incorporating results into my work and adapt my project accordingly, so that it really continues sustainably and contributes to the mission? Scaling is always a topic in projects anyway. It's also just a human thing to want something to grow, to get bigger, and to reach more people. Here, it's really important to plan for scaling early on. By that, we don't just mean quantitative growth, bigger, faster, further. Scaling can also mean, for example, the spreading of knowledge, so that more people find out about what you're doing. Scaling can also mean that what I've implemented in my own region, for example, might be picked up by a neighboring region, or maybe even by a larger business in the area that wants to adopt and adapt my micropublic transport solution. What always comes with this, of course, is a certain amount of letting go of what's your own and sharing knowledge. Without that, scaling becomes much more difficult, because if no one knows about it, it simply won't spread as quickly. And of course, it always helps to bring strong partners into the consortium, especially when it comes to bridging phases. Strong partners can sometimes carry topics and, well, project results through such phases. That's much more difficult for smaller players. For each of our key points, we've also listed a few methods below that can help you pursue this particular approach further. Regarding impact chains and mission orientation, for example, in my view, it's simply a matter of starting with some desktop research. I just take a look at what the big, pressing issues are, on a social policy level, on an economic policy level, and on an environmental policy level, for example. Is there something I can contribute there? Is this something I personally care about? Is there a way I can get involved? Of course, it also looks good to the funding agency if you're working on something that's not just important on a small scale, but actually has a bigger impact. Then, the Golden Circle by Simon Sinek is always a great approach when it comes to working on your purpose. So, what is it that really matters to me? Why am I even doing this? And there are several helpful impact models. I've listed two here, for example, the IOOI model, input, output, outcome, and impact, or the theory of change. Models like these simply help to analyze, understand, and improve the impact of your own initiatives. And especially with the theory of change, it's also very much about considering communication as part of the process. How do I communicate the social changes that have been achieved, for example? When we look at the second point of focus, understanding the problem and user needs, it was actually somewhat surprising for us that, even though we all know how important it is, the question, who needs this and for what, isn't always asked thoroughly enough or honestly enough. We learned that often there's already an idea of what the offering could look like, and people approach it in a very solution-driven way, being so convinced that what they've come up with is needed anyway, that the whole topic doesn't get enough attention. What are the real needs of the users? What do they actually need? And then, connected to that, the second aspect, does my idea actually fit the specific context in which it will be used? Are people even ready for it yet? So this can also have very practical dimensions, like, is what I want to do even easily accessible for people? Is the infrastructure already in place? Does this really match what people need right now, or is it still a bit too far ahead of its time? We've also learned that many people find it very difficult to clearly define their target audience. This might also be connected to the misconception that funders prefer it if you try to serve as many people as possible. We would say that it really is a misconception, because if you try to serve everyone, you won't be able to develop a truly good solution that really hits the nail on the head. And it really pays off to define your target audience as specifically and narrowly as possible, and to invest a lot of time into this process of defining your target group. People often underestimate just how important it is to actually identify problems and needs. What's also often missing is simply knowledge of the right methods. How can I interact with the target group, reach out to them, aside from just having conversations? What methods are out there that can help me systematically identify needs and benefits? And how can I approach this? Here, too, we've gathered a few recommendations. As already mentioned, it's really worthwhile to discuss internally. Who do you want to focus on? What problem do you want to solve? It's important here to define the target group narrowly and then to identify the requirements together with the target group, what they really need, what the solution has to deliver. That means you really have to involve the target group deliberately, seriously, and consistently. Consistently in the sense of not just once, not just before you start or at the beginning of the project during the kickoff workshop, but to keep thinking throughout the project. How can I keep getting feedback from the target group? How can I make sure that what I'm doing actually makes sense? So this feedback loop, how can I avoid being so convinced by my own solution that I finish developing it? And then afterwards I have to realize that it's not actually the case, that people don't really like it as much as I thought. Here again are a few recommended methods. Stakeholder mapping is simply a good starting point to consider who is really at the center of my interest and who, for example, I should keep informed. Desktop research in the sense of, what are the trends? What are the needs? Are there already studies on my topic, from other regions? Are there also examples and experiences from other regions? Participant observation, conversations, and interviews with the target group. And I also really like the personas method. With that, you really need to think carefully about prototypical users and truly consider what they genuinely need and what an effective solution would actually have to look like for them. So just putting yourself in someone else's shoes and thinking from their perspective about how the challenge can best be solved. User journey goes in a similar direction. So just play through the usage from the user's point of view. The value proposition canvas is also a wonderful tool to simply better understand the wishes and problems of potential users or customers. Design thinking is well known anyway. And also prototyping. So here, again, it's really about not waiting until the end for the solution to be finished, but instead going out very early, getting in touch with the target group, and gathering their feedback, even unfiltered feedback, to see whether the project is actually on the right track. As a third approach, we have defined agility and learning. There are various challenges surrounding project implementation. Some are internal, within the project team, for example, if someone resigns or leaves. There are also other factors that we have less control over internally, such as climatic conditions. If a field trial is planned and then the winter isn't cold enough, that can of course cause difficulties for an agricultural innovation project, especially when it comes to the project plan. The needs of the target groups can also change due to external factors, such as purchasing power or other environmental conditions. These, too, can completely upend my original plan and make adjustments necessary. Especially with projects that have a high degree of innovation, you start out with a lot of hypotheses. It can also turn out that these need to be discarded, that they need to be adjusted, and that the methods I originally wanted to use are no longer effective. What do these necessities for change mean? For the projects, it often means going back to square one. Oh, we need more money. We have to plan the experiment all over again. We need to invest more. We might not achieve the project goals. Of course, this is always accompanied by the fear that the funding might be withdrawn, that you might also come into conflict with the funding agency. And it also has a very strong cultural dimension. Admitting to course corrections is not easy. So, people would rather implement the project as it was originally planned instead of really redesigning it and making it beneficial, simply because they don't like the feeling of possibly being on the wrong track. So, what can we recommend now when it comes to agility and learning? It's important to really work together intensively as a project team and to already discuss during the project conception. How do we want to establish a culture of learning within the group? How do we make sure that we notice changes in the environment in time? That we are prepared if something changes within the project team? That we can also adapt if something around the project changes? And how do we also make sure that we don't overlook these moments and react too late? It also helps to frame the project to the funding agency by saying, "Hey, we're embarking on something new together here. This is something innovative. Yes, it comes with certain uncertainties, but we want to tackle it now." So it's also about building a kind of culture with the funding agency, saying, "Yes, not everything is clear and predictable, but we're going to make something meaningful out of it." It's also a good idea, when writing a project proposal, to make sure you always leave yourself options and keep some flexibility. So our recommendation here is, define milestones, but not necessarily exactly how you'll get there, for example, with how many workshops, etc., so that you can still adjust the methods for reaching the milestone. Back to the topic of culture. We also recommend getting in touch with the funding agency early on and planning feedback cycles with the administration, so they feel included in the process and changes don't just come out of nowhere. Methods that can help here also come from the Scrum framework, which originally comes from IT. It's also about planning short, scheduled sprints, short, planned work packages, and then always making sure there's a feedback loop with everyone involved afterwards, so that you can adjust things for the next steps if necessary. From our point of view, retrospectives should definitely be scheduled regularly and firmly within the project team, so that this shared reflection really becomes established in the project and turns into something routine. When it comes to the user perspective, design thinking is simply a wonderful tool, as is rapid prototyping, to quickly, just as mentioned earlier, get real feedback from the user group about whether the project is still heading in the right direction or whether a certain level of agility is needed in planning and finding solutions.
The fourth point we looked at, which also came up for us in last year's process, is the cooperation itself. And within the cooperation itself, of course, different questions arise. And we saw that this already starts with the choice of partners. That means, with which actors, with which organizations or individuals do I actually start my project most of the time? And that's exactly what we observed. Are they the ones you already know? That means trust and, so to speak, that perhaps a shared mindset forms the common foundation. And of course, that already narrows down the options. That's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it has definite advantages if you start a new project with people you've already worked with on 5 previous ones. But of course, it also limits new possibilities. That means they might not necessarily bring the resources needed for the current project. So here, too, it's important to reflect on this critically. Then there's always something like so to speak, a periphery and a center of cooperation. And at the center, there's usually one person, one key player, who drives the project forward. This is the person who is especially inspired and motivated by this cause, by this project. And of course, a lot of responsibility rests on this person. That means they usually have to go through ups and downs. And this often leads to the resilience of projects being at risk. Namely, if this person drops out, if for some reason they are no longer available or only available to a limited extent, an enormous amount depends on them. And anyone who has experienced this knows how difficult it is to find a replacement here. Then, of course, there's the other end of the spectrum, the fringes of cooperation. These are actors who are often only peripherally involved in the projects, but who are absolutely central because they often serve as interfaces to other interesting groups. For example, user groups or other potential partners. You have to make sure that these groups don't drop out over time, causing resources to be lost. Cooperation, especially what we call multi-actor constellations, means nothing other than this. I cooperate with actors who come from very different backgrounds. They have different backgrounds. It might be research together with industry, or maybe just together with an NGO. They all operate very differently. There are very different goals and values, and that makes communication more difficult. So, people say you somehow have to translate. In other words, you need a connection in the language. It becomes especially problematic when the logic of one partner dominates. That means, for example, if the research partner comes in and says, now everything has to work according to my logic, then communication becomes incredibly difficult and, in some cases, very stressful. Tensions, conflicts, and frustration often arise as well, because the participants enter projects with different expectations, which are sometimes not acknowledged, and sometimes the benefits of cooperation are not realized, often because too little attention is paid at the beginning to clarifying assumptions and expectations. So here, too, you should take the time for that. So, what are the recommendations? Of course, chemistry is important when starting projects, that you get along well with the others, but that shouldn't be the only factor when choosing partners. That means, ideally, you should try to find partners who also bring complementary resources into the project that you can use. What's important, this now refers specifically to the central actor, is that it works out as well as possible. Ownership also means, so to speak, the feeling that the project is something of my own, that it matters to me, that you manage to achieve that, and that you try to get as many people as possible to this status, that the project is important to them, too, and that it doesn't just weigh heavily on this one person, but is instead distributed evenly among different people. Cooperation structures are dynamic, as Elisabeth already mentioned in the context of agility. Often, you're dealing with situations where people change. You have to be prepared for that. 3 years is a long time, and especially if you plan to keep working on it even longer, you always have to expect that cooperation partners might change, that someone might leave. And you have to be prepared for that. And when you grow, meaning when it comes to scaling, you also have to consider how to deal with different roles. Suddenly, it becomes more important to distribute work differently, to work in a more collaborative way, and then to define who does what, who is responsible for what. Yes, and the last 3 points are basically the basics of successful cooperation: acting transparently, which means really making expectations clear, being empathetic, that is, recognizing that others have different backgrounds and interests, and really addressing and dealing with that openly. You have to work on this, otherwise it will eventually come to the surface and could actually lead to the end of the cooperation. And ultimately, this means that cooperation needs to be maintained. So, this is something you should always keep an eye on and also plan for in the project. It's not just an add-on, but a central asset for which you need to allocate appropriate resources. Methods like stakeholder mapping are very important when it comes to identifying potential partners. And then, of course, when it comes to defining these shared rules, it's really important to actually create cooperation agreements, to really write down what matters in the joint work. These are just examples of methods in this area. From our perspective, the issue of funding is, of course, central. What was interesting in our discussions was that this was hardly ever mentioned. So, hardly anyone said that funding is a problem. Well, you could draw different conclusions from that. We suspected that maybe it simply results from not having dealt with it enough, so people just didn't mention it to us. They tended to focus more on these other factors, on the other 5 that we're presenting to you here today. In further conversations we realized that there are actually very few clear ideas about the different ways to secure funding. So, actors are very much focused on the project itself, on the project outcome. They say, well, if what I produce is good enough, if the project outcome is good, then someone will surely be found who will pay for it. So, to exaggerate a bit, that's kind of the motto, but, so to speak, that can be true to a certain extent. However, it also needs to be thought through consistently in terms of who do I actually need on board so that this organization or person will really support it. So that means the roles are also very, very little differentiated. Who could actually become important in terms of utilization or financing here? Very often, the thought process ends with, well, my project results benefit everyone in the community or in the region. So, really, the municipality should be the one to pay. That's one possible way of thinking, but very often it doesn't. It doesn't turn out well, because of course the municipality also says, we have to take on a lot of responsibility then. So that means we need a broader understanding of the business model here, and don't let yourself be put off by the term business model. It's not always just about market-oriented processes, meaning charging money for things, but rather it's about considering for whom my project outcome, needs to be so attractive that he or she is willing to provide resources. And resources is intentionally chosen as a broad term here because it's not always just about providing money for this service, but maybe also about offering time, personal contributions, networks, or knowledge. Over the long term, you need a wide variety of resources, and it's not always just about money, though of course money is also important. On the income side, you make use of a broad portfolio of financing options. It's not always just fee for service, meaning you offer a service and then receive money in exchange. There are also things like crowdfunding, crowd investing, and even memberships, where you define a kind of membership structure and collect dues. Other possibilities include foundations, or of course, if you're dealing with short-term funding gaps, classic financing options like banks, which you can certainly make use of. But what's important, and we've also learned this from our conversations, is that diversification is key. So, don't put all your eggs in one basket when it comes to financing. And, thinking in terms of business models also means considering the expense side of things. So, in other words, don't let yourself be tempted to build up structures from the funding program that you might not be able to cover cost-wise later on. Make sure from the very beginning to plan things economically and efficiently, because during those 3 years of the project duration, or however long your project is set up for, certain things will be financed. And maybe, at first, you don't immediately think about how frugal it could actually be. Yes, so it's important to keep this thought in mind right from the start, because often something gets set on a certain path, and then it's very difficult to scale it back later. Connecting to existing structures is important. Sometimes it's good to have a partner involved who can perhaps take on certain tasks as part of their daily work. Secretarial services or construction work, where the partner finds it easier, maybe doesn't have to spend any money, and thus can also contribute positively to the project. It's important to qualify members and project staff, of course making sure that I don't have to outsource everything, that I don't have to pay someone for every single task, but rather that from the very beginning I look at how my people, who work with me and for me on the project, can also take on certain things themselves. It's important, and this basically ties back to the previous point, to also consider the financial partners as part of the cooperation, and, if necessary, to be willing to let them go. The methods here include the classic business plan, but probably better, because it's more dynamic, is the business model canvas. So take a look at that, as it also takes into account the whole user and usage dimension of initiatives. The last point, but last but not least, though something has to be last, is the topic of communication. Here too, we've seen that communication is often viewed as an add-on. Very often, people say they simply don't have the resources to actively take that into account in the project as well. But it would be important, because of course communication, especially external communication, can have a lot of, and very positive, effects on those other 5 points. Here too, just like with the overall orientation of the project, communication is often not targeted enough to specific audiences. People say, well, we'll just make a brochure at the end, or we'll put together a project profile for a project database, which is supposed to be suitable for everyone. Think about who you want to reach. Also consider how you can best translate that, so to speak, into the language of your target audience. So that means communicating the results and impact must be a central message in terms of content. We'll also hear more about this in detail with one of the project examples later on. But this doesn't necessarily have to be subject-specific or technical content. It's often about storytelling, packaging everything into stories so that what you've accomplished here and the value you provide can connect as well as possible with your target audience. Communication shouldn't just be the responsibility of one person or a specific department. In the project, actors are out and about every day in rural areas or within their own communities. And the better all project participants are able to communicate about the initiative, the greater their reach will naturally be. That means you should make use of the potential of the people you have in the project to communicate effectively as well. Especially when you think about target groups, consider the people you need for long-term sustainability. You need them from the very beginning, and you have to reach them with your communication right from the start. And make sure to include your own work package in your considerations. I know, it can all seem like a lot when you look at all these points together. But communication is, of course, also a key here to support the other factors as well. Stakeholder mapping is also an essential method here. You can use it for various aspects, because it also clarifies whom you should ideally reach with which message. Take the time to develop communication strategies tailored to specific target groups. It doesn't have to be anything huge, but try to identify the target groups and define the key messages for these groups, as well as the channels through which you can reach them. These are just a few simple steps you need to take. But do take them so that your communication becomes more tailored to your target groups. And of course, make use of existing platforms, especially in research. This is always crucial, so that people actually hear about it. So this is the scenario in utilization, where someone else is supposed to continue working with the project results. And that, so to speak, needs to get through.